So here we are at the beginning of another new year, looking back at the year just gone past and looking forward to the new year. For us as lawyers at Templars, what has 2022 been like for Ross?
I think that in 2022, we definitely saw a lot of players positioning themselves more for a wider African play.
In the oil and gas space was characterized by divestments by international oil companies in Nigeria.
One of the major drivers of activity for me in 2022 was the Petroleum Industry Act.
We've spoken enough about the year past. We should just begin to talk about 2023.
Yeah.
Where do we see the year going?
Yeah, so the conversion deadline is going to be a big one for the first quarter of the year. The Petroleum Industry Act requires any operator that intends to move over into that regime from the old Petroleum Act regime to do so within 18 months of the passage of the Petroleum Industry Act. And that 18 months expires in February of 2023.
It's the healthcare space. So the world is in the aftermath of a global pandemic, not really at the end yet, but coming to the tail end. And in Africa, Nigeria in particular as well, we know that we have had a huge deficit in that space. So what did we see in 2022 that we think will continue in 2023? Investment. And also the tech sector, particularly the fintech space, will continue to be very busy. We expect to see a lot of work and transactions and deals in that space.
So I found the point you made about potential oversaturation in the financial services space very interesting. I mean, because it's sort of, there's a sense in which it cuts across the central theme that Nigeria is underbanked. We have lots of people outside of the formal financial sector, and therefore we're pushing for a drive for financial inclusion. So how would you argue that there's potential oversaturation in a market where financial inclusion is essentially the biggest worry, amongst other things, of the central bank and other players?
I know it sounds at odds, right, with a country that is actually actively trying to reach financial inclusion. But what we've been seeing is that the needs of those who are outside of the formal financial system are not being met by those traditional commercial banks. They're being met by our fintechs. They're being met by our telecoms, right? Because we don't see these traditional banks setting up brick and mortar branches in the extreme rural areas. Rather, what we see is that someone in those areas simply needs a smartphone and all their financial services needs are met.
So essentially, the incumbents are concentrating themselves in the same space and chasing essentially the same people, is what you're saying?
That's what it looked like in 2022. It would be interesting to see how it plays out in 2023. A lot of these incumbents, like I mentioned, are actually newly licensed banks. So it'll be interesting to see what their strategies are to play out. I mean, we've already mentioned how a lot of them are trying to take on the fintechs and play in that space.
Absolutely. So potentially that's a play that is available to traditional lenders who will combine the use of technology to essentially reach the unbanked, and therefore may not necessarily create the...
Precisely, but we have to see them actually do it. Right? It has to be a definitive strategy for those traditional banks.
But having said that, I mean, us as Templars, we've had quite a number of new licensees who've advised, who we see, although they set up a brick and mortar space, are essentially digital banks masquerading as traditional banks.
Absolutely. But I think that, we have to be clear when we talk about the oversaturation. We're not necessarily speaking to those digital banks, because those digital banks, they can't even meet the demand at the moment because of this problem with financial inclusion that we talk about. It's more when you see those banks who at the moment appear to be chasing after the same corporate market, the same retail accounts as all of the other banks. But like I said, 2023 will show their strategies unfold, and perhaps they will actually be seeking to do more with financial inclusion.
Okay, so I mean, one other thing that I suspect will be important come the rest of the year would be infrastructure. Yes. And you've spoken about one of the most important transactions we've worked on in the recent, I think, past 7 years, the
Yes.
Lekki Deep Sea Port. I mean, nicely following the Lekki Deep Sea Port is another transaction that we see that is going to be very active in 2023, which is the Badagry Deep Sea Port,
Yes.
which essentially will be at the other end of Lagos. So that's one thing we see in terms of infrastructure. Again, I mean, we're proud to say we saw the Second Niger Bridge project commissioned recently by the president. That's also another transaction in which we played an active role in terms of advising the project sponsors for that one. So we've seen ports, we're seeing toll roads and bridges, and very likely in 2023 we're going to see airports. We're
Yes.
going to see
Rails.
potentially the new government look more at public-private partnerships, and power and other sorts of infrastructure are likely to be very important come 2023. But regardless of what sector you're looking at, I'm sure that topmost in the minds of every business and every project is, what is the fiscal regime going to be like in 2023? So, Shesa, what do you think about this?
Yes, so there's quite a bit of activity there's been since 2020 in the fiscal space. New changes every year.
And
There's a new.
what's the reason for that?
So I guess the government is trying to catch up with the evolution of the economy. Digital services, for example, like I mentioned earlier, were ones where you could form a loophole, and a lot of revenue was being bypassed in that way. So now there's, I guess, some regulation in that area where those kinds of services are now being taxed in Nigeria. There's
So,
a
so
new
essentially, you're saying that you don't necessarily require a physical presence
presence in
Nigeria
Nigeria.
to come within the Nigerian tax bracket.
Yes, not anymore. So, and they continue to evolve in their understanding of the market as well. Like Zelda, mentioned earlier, there's a finance bill, for example, that has captured the taxation of digital assets. So, if you dispose of digital assets now, there's a likely capital gains tax implication on those, and of course, that would affect.
And what sort of assets will qualify as digital assets?
Yeah,
Just
so
out of interest.
that's what I was just going to mention, because that's part of the problem one faces in the fiscal space in Nigeria. There seems to be some lack of clarity when it comes to definitions, categorizations and things like that. We would expect, of course, that digital assets like this should solve problems that relating to cryptocurrency. What exactly, as an example, what exactly is it? Is it a good? Is it what is it being recognized as such? We don't know if the finance bill as it is doesn't provide much clarity in that regard. We don't know if it's eventually passed, before the new government comes in, there's going to be more clarity provided in that space. But at least it's good to see, the government thinking in that light. It's good to see the government trying to drive infrastructure by, providing incentives. There's new incentives that are provided for gas investments in Nigeria. So a new investment allowance that's provided if you invest in that industry. So I guess the fiscal changes are sort of like a response to the need for investment, the need for infrastructure, the need to carry, I guess, the policy of the government along with what happens actually in the economy.
I find it interesting, though, Sesan, if I may, that you mentioned, this taxation on the disposal of digital assets.
Yeah.
Because as we all know, the Central Bank of Nigeria
Yes.
actually says that you can't process cryptocurrency transactions through the Nigerian banking system.
Exactly.
So it's very interesting that we have an administration on the one hand says you can't do this, but if you do
did,
it,
If you
you'll
do
pay
it, you'll
tax
pay
on
taxes
it.
on it.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting scenario.
is.
I'd like to see how that plays out this year.
Yeah.
But I think what that brings out, and is also an important issue for us as lawyers in Nigeria, the problem of uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty,
exactly.
statutory uncertainty.
Yeah.
I've heard, listening to Shesa talk about the Petroleum Industry Act and the tax statutes as well. There's a lot that requires clarification.
Yeah.
And to some degree, that's where us as lawyers come in to assist our clients in bringing some clarity where there isn't clarity, and also liaising between our clients and regulators, government agencies to solve loads of problems. So it seems like it's an interesting next 12 months awaiting us as gatekeepers of the Nigerian economy, and of course the Ghanaian economy, where we also have
Absolutely.
recently opened offices. So 2023, here we come.
Yeah.
Indeed.